So thank you again for coming to this workshop. The goal of it is to take you from cryptography basics all the way to some of the very Bitcoin specific details like address generation, wallet structure, and what really happens when you go to spend funds. We tried to make this accessible to all levels, so we'll be starting with a refresher on cryptography fundamentals. So hopefully, no matter what stage you are in learning about Bitcoin, you'll walk away having learned something new. All right. So we're going to do a quick intro. My name is Stacie Waleyko. I've been with Casa for about 2 years now, working on our backend systems. Prior to Bitcoin, I spent a few years in the enterprise blockchain space. And before that, I did some time in the ad tech industry. I'm very excited in Bitcoin education and making sure it's a technology that's really accessible to everyone. So I'm just so happy to be here and wanted to thank you all again for joining us.
Yeah, my name is Ron Stoner. I joined the Casa team last year as the head of security, and I've worked a variety of positions in the cryptocurrency industry. I also organize and speak at the DEF CON Blockchain Village. I was the curator for the cryptocurrency security standard auditor exam, and I also sit on that committee for that standard, and I love all things security and Bitcoin. And also thank you all for joining our talk today.
Cool. All right, let's get started by reviewing some cryptography basics. So we hear the term keys a lot when we talk about Bitcoin, especially when we're dealing with self-custody. And to start, I want to answer the most basic question: what are cryptographic keys? And at a high level, a key is just a random string of bits. And when we look at one in human readable format, it looks like this long line of letters and numbers that we have here. And the longer and more random these letters and numbers are, the harder it is to crack the key. Keys are the building blocks used to perform a number of important cryptographic operations like encryption, decryption, and message signing. So most people are familiar with encryption. We have examples of this that go all the way back to ancient times. There's something called the Caesar cipher that was used to protect military communications, where the method of encryption was each letter in the message was shifted by 3 positions in the alphabet. So A would get encrypted to D, and then D would map back to A upon decryption. And another way we can use keys is for assigning messages. This is really cool because it allows for the creation of digital signatures that can be used the same way regular signatures are used in the real world. They're used to prove the authenticity of a message, check that the message hasn't been tampered with during transit, and ensure non-repudiation from the signer's part. So let's go ahead and take a look at the 2 main key types. Okay, 2 types of commonly used cryptographic systems are symmetric and asymmetric. With symmetric, you've only got 1 key. This key can be used to encrypt, decrypt, as well as create and verify your digital signatures. Examples of this would be passwords and shared secrets. We use this kind of stuff all the time. Okay, and then next we have asymmetric, and this is when you use separate keys for your cryptographic operations. This is often known as public key cryptography, and as you may have guessed from the title of this workshop, it's what Bitcoin uses. So the 2 types of keys are your private key and your public key, and by its name, your private key is the one that you keep secret. It's really important that no one else knows it because it's the one that you use to create your digital signatures and decrypt data. If someone else gets it, they can start forging your signature or decrypting messages that are really meant for your eyes only. And then the other kind of key is the public key, and this is the one that you share. Others use it to verify your digital signature or to encrypt messages that they want to send specifically to you. Now, it's very easy to go from a private key to a public key, but nearly impossible to go the other way. And that's why it's safe to share your public key. You can't rederive the private key from it. Because of the way these 2 keys interact, public key cryptography is often considered a really good way of expressing digital identity, and it's the foundation for a lot of the online identity applications that we have today. Okay, and then one more piece of cryptography 101 that we really need to cover is hashing. Hashing is when you use a one-way function to create a digital fingerprint of a piece of data. The output is a fixed size depending on the specific kind of hash function that you use. It's deterministic, which means that you can hash the same message over and over again, and you'll always get the same result. So to illustrate this, I hashed the phrase, there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. And I used a website that I just typed into Google. And then to verify it, I also used this command on my computer to do it. And as you can see, both resulted in the same hash, which is awesome. It illustrates that that this hash function is deterministic. It's always going to produce the same result. And as kind of a bonus, it's unlikely either tool is lying to me because they both match up. So even if hash functions seem like this sparkly black box, the cool thing is we still have a lot of tools at our disposal to create and verify them.
One of the other concepts we want to touch on today that people have heard the term, but I don't know that they can necessarily explain it. I always ask people, have you heard of a digital signature? And they say yes. And I ask them, can you explain to me what's really going on when you do that? And they kind of hum and haw or say no. So what's really going on when we're talking about digital signatures is we're proving that a message or a document was not tampered with. We're validating it, we're verifying, we're not trusting. And what we do, the way this works, is we take the contents, that could be an email, that could be a file, it could be a message, and we hash them using the hashing concept that Stacie just talked about. That hash is then encrypted with the sender's private key. So part of the key pair that we're talking about today, the content and the encrypted hash are then bundled up together, and that's sent off to the recipient. Now the recipient receives that, they make their own hash of the content, they decrypt the sender hash using the public key, the other side of that key pair, and then they compare the two hashes. So if the original hash equals the recipient's hash, you know that the document wasn't modified in transit. None of the bits or bytes were modified. Nobody's doing anything with malicious intent. So at its very core, that's essentially what digital signatures are doing. When we talk about digital signatures, encryption, and hashing, there's some standards and some terms that you guys may have heard out there in the industry. The Data Encryption Standard, or DES, this was the standard in the 70s. And it was symmetric, but no one really uses it anymore because it only encrypted 56 bits of data at a time, and that made it really easy to hack. So even though nobody really uses it today, it really did create the foundation and that layer for the more secure encryption methods that we use today. AES is one that's kind of an industry standard out there. It's one of the most secure and commonly used encryption methods. And instead of doing individual bits of data, it's encrypting blocks and processing that. And if you see a number after AES, like 128 or 256, what that's indicating is that's indicating the block size. AES uses multiple rounds of encryption. It has a number of mathematical steps with substitution and transposition, mixing in plain text and other methodologies. But it's one that's very important to highlight that's out there being used today. RSA is another one that's popular, but it's more on the asymmetric side. And this is talking about verifying large prime numbers is how RSA really works. But it's great for communication, and it's another one that people should be aware of. And then the last one we list here is SHA, which stands for the Secure Hash Algorithm. And this deals with the hashing concept we talked about. SHA is great for taking information and hashing it and doing that one-way function. And SHA is great for doing it in a secure manner. You may have seen SHA-1, which was used in SSL certificates, but was deprecated in January 2016 because it wasn't secure enough. So when we're talking about Bitcoin, Bitcoin actually uses SHA-256, so a more secure version of that. Now that we've learned a little bit about encryption, digital signatures, hashing, and some of the popular ones that are out there, let's jump into the specifics on how Bitcoin really uses these concepts and brings them together. When we are sending Bitcoin, when we're doing transactions, what we're really doing is we're signing things. We're digitally signing them with our private keys. And Bitcoin uses a digital signing algorithm called ECDSA. It's elliptic curve cryptography. And the word curve's in there because What we are really doing is we're really dealing with curves here, as you can see on the chart. At a general level, you have a mathematical equation that plots the curve on a graph. We pick a random point on that curve, and that's considered our point of origin. And then we generate a random number, the private key. By doing a math equation using that random number and that point of origin, we can generate a second point on the curve, and that point becomes our public key. And now we've generated a public-private key pair that corresponds to each other. So when you see things like public key and private key, they're very much associated, and this is how it's being done on the back end. It's important to note that ECDSA does not encrypt. We're not hiding data. We're signing data and validating it. It's based on, like RSA, it uses the discrete log problem. So there's a lot of math and cryptography on the back end. Same level of security as RSA, but it's got the shorter key length. So what this does is less bandwidth, storage, and processing power. And for longer keys, it's considerably longer to brute force. So we're getting a lot of security benefits there. But don't get too attached to ECDSA because Taproot, Bitcoin Improvement Proposal 341 upgrade, is going to include Schnorr signatures. And I've put a picture here of Klaus-Peter Schnorr, just because we really should be highlighting the cryptographers and the giants whose shoulders that we're standing on today. Schnorr signatures are going to be great because they include secure proofs. They have a smaller footprint. So instead of 71 bytes, we're getting 64-byte signatures. So we're saving space on chain. There's less assumptions about the discrete log problem. So it's easier to implement and process the system. This was patented up until 2008. And Bitcoin is actually going to be one of the first major open source implementations that's going to be using this. And the big benefit is instead of doing single signatures like we do with ECDSA, we're going to be able to aggregate all those signatures and put it on chain. So there's going to be more privacy benefits. There's going to be savings. It's a great piece of technology that's right around the corner.
Cool. So everything that we're talking about kind of feeds into the question, what does it mean to actually own a Bitcoin? And Bitcoin addresses correspond to how you want to be able to spend your Bitcoin. And that's either going to be a public key in the simplest scenario. This is often referred to as P2PKH, P2WPKH, if anyone has heard those terms before. Or for more complex spending conditions, we're going to be using a script. So like a multi-sig script actually has all the public keys of the devices involved in the multi-sig scheme. So when you want to spend the Bitcoin, you actually use the matching private key or keys if you're using more than one key pair to sign a message. And you're basically signing a message that says, I am transferring ownership of this Bitcoin to someone else's address. Then you go ahead and broadcast the signature. And when it gets to another node, that node is going to check that the message was signed with the correct private key. This is basic digital signature verification. And the nice thing is that while a digital signature is computationally expensive to make, it's very cheap to verify. Once the node confirms that the signature is valid, your transaction is accepted by the network. It's going to go ahead and propagate it. But if the signature, which is oftentimes referred to as the witness, is invalid, let's say you use the wrong private key, you maybe don't have the private key and you made something up, or maybe you're using multisig and you're supposed to sign with 2 keys and you only signed with 1. All of these scenarios are going to result in the transaction being rejected by the network. Nodes will not forward any information that they have not verified for themselves. So owning Bitcoin comes down to having the private key or keys that correspond to the address with the funds. Proper Bitcoin ownership is really about responsible private key management. And private keys can be generated and live in lots of different places. They can live in hardware wallets like a Trezor or a Ledger. These are cool because these devices are dedicated to this one single purpose. They can live in your phone's secure element if you're using a mobile wallet. They can live on a piece of paper, which we call a paper wallet. They can even live in your brain, which we call brain wallets, and that's when you memorize it. Really cool concept, but really insecure, so we do not recommend it. And if you're familiar with seed phrases, they're basically private keys, which is why it's so, so important that they don't fall into the wrong hands. And all of this goes to that famous phrase, we just celebrated proof of keys, not your keys, not your coins. This is why it's so popular. If you don't have the private keys to actually sign off on the addresses where your funds are held, you don't actually have any control over them. So holding your own keys is often seen as the first major step to taking advantage of the freedom and the self-sovereignty that Bitcoin offers. But I'd be remiss not to acknowledge that this comes with its own set of concerns, mainly around security. So are your keys secure against attackers? What about accidental loss? Like, what if you make a mistake? There's really a lot to think about here, but that's not a conversation for this workshop. If anyone is interested, Jameson is doing a privacy and security workshop on Thursday with Matt Odell and Michael Haley, and that's probably going to be a great segue into some of this stuff. But now Ron's going to take us on a demo.
Cool. Let me go ahead and bring up my console. So we should see a console here. Let me go ahead and increase the size for you all. And we've created a Python script just for demo purposes. And what I will highlight is that this script should never be used for any production reasons. It shouldn't be used to generate keys that are going to hold any value. This doesn't use any hardware wallets or multiple sources of entropy. This is just to display a couple of the concepts that we've listed here today. So the first thing we want to display is that brain wallet that Stacie was talking about. So we can generate an insecure brain wallet key set. And the way brain wallets worked was they took something that was in your brain, a word, a passphrase, a lyric, movie quote, something like that, even your email address, and that was essentially your private key. So it was great for usability, but it was horrible for security, because if we put the word Satoshi in here, we can see that it inputs it, and it basically runs it through one round of SHA-256 and then generates a key pair based off of it. And then from that key pair, based off of some magic math and some things that we'll talk about in this demonstration, we can get an address outside of it. But the things that I wanted to demonstrate here is that these aren't very secure, but we can use those to generate the key pairs that we're talking about. The more secure method would be to generate an ECDSA key set using that elliptic curve cryptography. And in order to do this, we need to generate private key material. And that private key material could be words and things like that. But when we're doing ECDSA and we want to do it in a more secure fashion, we should be using randomized hex values. There is a hex value, let me see if I didn't copy it, on the internet that we can use, that I don't think I'm going to be exposing anybody's wallet, because this is actually, oh, looks like I don't have it. Well, regardless, if you ended up putting a bunch of hex information in here, it should be 64 bytes or 32 characters. We can generate keys off of that as well. And we can get the pub key. We can go through all of the hashing mechanisms that we talked about earlier. And then eventually we get to a Bitcoin address. The script is also good because if you press enter for random, it's going to use the system entropy, os.urandom, to grab some random entropy and generate a key set off of that. And when we're generating keys on things like hardware wallets, that's what it's doing. It's using multiple sources of entropy from the system and other mechanisms to get the initial string that's generating the private key, that gets the public key, that then gets the address. And if we do another random one here, we can see that we're getting different addresses each time using random system entropy. If you guys wanted to try this yourself, you can actually do this using Bitcoin nodes. So if you have a Bitcoin node that's synced to the network, you can use Bitcoin CLI to generate keys, as well as dump that private key information if you want to. And then here's the commands for that if you guys want to try this. The other thing you can do, you can take some of those brain wallets that are out there on websites, because there is websites that categorize that stuff and list those things as being not secure, as being compromised, and see if you generate the same key pairs. You can actually walk through the Python script and look at each of the individual functions as to how it's taking that stuff, how it's hashing it, and how it's generating the key pairs and ultimately the address. And I think Stacie's going to touch on that right now as to what's really going on when it's doing all of those operations.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. That was a great demo. So I've been watching the chat and checking out your questions, and I'm seeing a lot of questions about having multiple keys, derivation paths. Someone asked a question about SHA-256. These next set of slides, they're going to go into the nitty-gritty. So hopefully we'll be able to answer a lot of these questions along the way. So now that we've learned about keys and we've actually seen key and address generation, let's walk through how to go from a key pair to an address. And I'm going to take you through the most basic example, which is making an address from a single public key. This is referred to P2PKH, pay to public key hash, if anyone is familiar with those terms. I will be using the diagram on the left as a guide. It is from a really fantastic book called Mastering Bitcoin by Andreas Antonopoulos. It's one of like the OG Teach Me About Bitcoin books. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. But do note that it's a little bit dated. It doesn't cover a newer feature called SegWit, but I still really like the diagram because it covers all the basics. So earlier we touched upon hashing, and that was important because addresses are basically hashes. In this example, the input we're going to use is a public key, but for more complex spending conditions such as multisig or something called wrapped SegWit, you're going to be using a script as your input. Now, the reason why we hash is because public keys can be really long. A compressed ECDSA public key is 33 bytes, which comes out to 44 characters in base 64 encoding. And that's actually still pretty big. And we're just talking about the simplest kind of address with one public key. It's not a multi-sig script with multiple things in it. It's just the smallest thing we can make. And in addition to that, there's actually a number of really good reasons to use a character set smaller than base 64. Okay, so let's go to this diagram. Take a look at that blue box on the top. This is where we are now. We have our input, and we're going to go ahead and compute the hash. So we're going to move over to these green boxes. In this example, they use the hash 160 function, which is actually made up of these two green boxes. It's a double hash where the first step is to compute the SHA-256 hash, and then the second step is to compute the RIPEMD 160 hash. Now, the exact details of this hashing step may slightly vary depending on what kind of address you are creating. For example, SegWit P2WSH uses only a single SHA-256 hash, but either way, you end up with a hash of a fixed size. Now, note that at this point, because hash functions are one way, we actually can't go backwards and derive the public key from the hash. Because of this, when you're ready to spend, you're going to have to provide the original input. In our case, it's a public key, and you do this so that nodes can validate the address. For those familiar with multisig, you've probably heard that you need to back up the public keys of all devices in the setup, and this is why. You need to be able to recreate the multisig redeem script that the address was derived from, because you can't go backwards. Okay. So let's go back to the diagram. We are currently on the second blue box. We have a hash. The last thing we need to do is convert it to a more compact format and add a little bit of human readable data and some error checking. So in our example, we're going to use base 58 encoding, which is kind of like base 64, but without a number of commonly misinterpreted characters like lowercase l and capital I. But if you're using SegWit, you're going to be converting to something called Besh32, which is kind of like base 32. It is case insensitive, but the character set has been specifically chosen to optimize for their error detection algorithm. Final step is to add in a small human readable prefix at the beginning, which I have some examples of on the next slide, as well as an error checking mechanism called the checksum. And a checksum is an additional 4 to 6 bytes at the end, which help protect against mistyped addresses. This is really great. It can actually detect if you're manually copying an address and you get a character wrong. which is nice because if it didn't do that, it would probably let you send funds into the ether to an address where no one has the private keys for. And that's actually what it means when we say coins are lost. But this is all I'm going to say about address derivation. I know this slide's a little bit long. This stuff can be complex depending on what you're trying to do. And on the next slide, we have an example of a bunch of different address types that you can check out. Okay, cool. So in that previous example, we only walked through one kind of address, and it's the one on the top, but there's actually many more. As you can see in that middle column, all addresses actually begin with a human readable portion. And right now, you can tell the address type from it. And from a privacy perspective, this is like not that great. You know, if addresses begin with 1, it's going to a single public key. So you know that's not a multi-sig address. If it's going to 3, you know it's going to a script, and the chances of it being multi-sig are a little bit higher. After spending, you can verify by looking at the data on the blockchain. If you go down to the second box, we also have prefixes for testnet, which is great. So it can be M, N, or 2, which is just really nice to be able to differentiate between mainnet and testnet. And then if you get down to the bottom, you'll see BC1 and TB1. These are prefixes for SegWit. We will probably, or native SegWit, we'll probably continue to see these and hopefully, see more of them in the future. But I think a lot of wallets are still playing catch up with this.
Some of you may have seen vanity addresses where you can put your name in the beginning of the address or things like that. And people have asked me, why can't it just be my name to start or my email address? And this right here is why, because they need to be prefixed based off of the conditions in the system and the cryptography and all the map and hashing functions that go into address generation. So while it may seem simple to just be like, can't you just make it my email address? Well, no, we can't, and here's why.
Yeah, definitely. I love that example. I wish we could do a whole thing on vanity addresses. Cool. So lastly, I do want to touch on some enhancements to how addresses and keys are structured in wallets, because it's a little more complicated than just having a single public-private key pair. And this is going to be the slide if you're interested in derivation paths, if you're interested in like generating more than one key pair for your wallet. This is the stuff that's going to be of interest to you. So for privacy and security reasons, address reuse is strongly discouraged in Bitcoin, but this means that every time you want to generate a new address, you have to make a new pair of public and private keys. And in the early days, the Bitcoin Core client would generate 100 random key pairs on startup and create more as needed. That was great. You never had to reuse addresses, but the problem was there was nothing tying these keys together. So if you wanted to make a backup, you needed to back up every single pair of keys. And luckily in 2012, a proposal called BIP32 was made for something called hierarchical deterministic wallets. These are wallets that allow you to derive many sets of keys from a single random number called a seed. And it turns out there's a ton of advantages to the structure. And I have a diagram on it on the right. This also comes from Mastering Bitcoin. But one of the most important things is now you can deterministically recreate wallets from a single seed. So you no longer have to back up every single pair of keys you've ever generated. You just need that one seed. Shortly afterwards, another proposal called BIP39 was made to map seeds to a set of mnemonic words. And this is how you get those seed phrases that you're probably familiar with if you've ever set up a hardware wallet. Okay, now I'm going to do a quick demo. Okey-doke. You should be able to see my screen. Awesome. This is a website called iancoleman.io. It's really awesome. But we're going to walk through some of the BIP32 and BIP39 functionality that they have. Before I get into it, everyone promise me you'll never use this for real funds. There are so many ways that it can go wrong. And Ron's actually going to go into some secure key generation points after this. But if you just use a website from the internet like this to generate your private keys or do anything with your private keys, like expose them at all, you're not going to have a good time. So over here, they have a demo where you can generate a random mnemonic phrase, and I'm going to go ahead and do that. And look, there it is. Nice. And actually, anybody, if you want to like take a screenshot and write these words in later, you're going to be able to derive all the exact same information that I am right now, whether or not you use the Ian Coleman tool or you use a script that you write yourself or like someone else's tool, because it's all deterministic. So as we mentioned earlier, the seed phrase is just like the human readable version. This BIP39 seed over here is what it looks like to a computer in computer language. And then we also have the BIP32 root key. This is basically at the root of that HD wallet tree that we saw in the previous slide. So now we're going to scroll down and get into derivation paths. I'm going to work with BIP32. That's really like the easiest one to talk about. BIP44, 49, 84, 141. These are all kind of like standards that get into specific definitions of how you use derivation paths. And a derivation path looks like this, and it really corresponds to a leaf in the tree. And so if I scroll down, I'm just going to look at M0 for now. And if I scroll down, I actually can see every single address, every single public key, and every single private key that would be generated for each leaf in the tree. And if you can, go as far as you want here and, go 5 and 20, and it'll take you to a different branch in the tree. There are a number of attacks that have been mentioned in the past where an attacker will basically trick you into sending funds to yourself, but to like some crazy derivation path. Like obviously it's gonna be crazier than this, that you can never find. And that's why they're ransom attacks. You have to give them the money before they tell you the derivation path. And this is kind of like what's going on for all that stuff. But really awesome tool, especially for development, especially for learning. Check it out if you have time. There's also some other cool tools that he has. But yeah, that's how BIP32 and BIP39 kind of work in the real world.
Cool, great demo, Stacie, thank you. I'm a security guy and I always need to give my security spiel and caveat this with, we're generating keys and these keys are being used to either protect sensitive information or protect digital value of some sort. So when we're doing it, there is some security considerations that we need to really think about to do this properly. Number one, whom is generating your key pairs? Is it you or is it somebody you know that's doing it and then handing them to you? How do you know they didn't keep a backup or they don't have a file called keys.txt on their desktop? Which if they do, I don't recommend that person generate your keys. It should be somebody knowledgeable enough with the system and the processes that are taking place that they have a level of familiarity and comfortability with it. Because there's little tiny gotchas and caveats where in digital signatures, if they don't know that the K value needs to be randomized, you're in for a bad time. Bad things are going to happen and you're going to lose money or value at some point. The second thing to consider is your environment. And this can go pretty deep. It starts with things like don't do it in the coffee shop. Watch out for shoulder surfers, people behind you watching your screen or taking a picture if you get up to walk away. Do you have your key material on the screen in your laptop all the time? But it also goes a little bit further to when I generate keys and things like that. I actually sweep the room of all electronics. So we all have watches, smartwatches, we have microphones and cameras in our pockets all the time. Even our smart TVs have cameras and microphones where they could potentially be listening. So if you're generating keys and you're reading out my private key or my seed word is correct horse battery staple, somebody could be listening to that. So be aware of the environment that you're generating in. It should be done on an offline or air-gapped machine or hardware wallet. And the reason for this is they're not network connected to the internet. They can't get malware through a network connection. That doesn't mean they can't be hacked. It's never 100% in security, but we are taking the steps to mitigate and kind of make those attackers jump through multiple hoops to be able to compromise our key material. Proper entropy is a big one. So you saw during our demo, we demoed an insecure brain wallet using some entropy from up here. And then we also generated or showed a more secure version using ECDSA and some entropy from the urandom operating system. In order to do this, you would really want to use a TRNG, a true random number generator, or a deterministic random bit generator. These are things that measure electrical impulses. They can do entropy in a variety of ways that has actually been statistically tested against some of these standards and things here at the bottom. So we're not all mathematicians, we're not all cryptographers. We don't have the resources to break down all these devices and audit every single piece of code and test them. So at some point, you know, your verification does have to become trust unless you're going through that whole end-to-end process. Now, you can put your trust in some of these standards and institutions like NIST and the Die-Hard statistical test. And what these tests do is they are standards and they test some of these devices and these entropy devices to make sure they are truly random. And you're not going to have an issue where we find out that certain versions of Android didn't include a big enough entropy pool. And as a result, a blockchain wallet mobile app is now losing user funds because they're generating the same key pairs. So there's a lot really to think about with this. You can even really go offline and analog and do this with dice and cards and a copy of the script that Stacie showed you on an air-gapped computer that's been audited. If it's something that you're not comfortable, find an expert that is, or find a resource that can help you out with this process. We're here for you guys. This is stuff that we love to talk about. And as you can see in our presentation today, there's a lot that really goes into this, but if you can consume the information and jump into it, you can really do it correctly. To summarize our workshop here today, public keys are being used to create addresses. Those private keys, which correspond to the public keys, are used to create digital signatures. Digital signatures are used to spend and move Bitcoin. And at the root of every Bitcoin wallet, we have a seed, which is essentially a private key. So that private key is really the key to the kingdom. It's highly sensitive and it should be protected. And now we're at a point where those seed phrases we have human readable versions of those. So we have a system that's processing and crunching all of this technical math and cryptography, but at the end of it, we've got a human readable version of our private key. We've provided some additional resources here for you all as well. I saw in the chat somebody was asking about the Mastering Bitcoin book. That's by Andreas Antonopoulos. You can find that linked here. It's an amazing resource for people that are trying to learn more about this. We've listed some other links here because a lot of these concepts that we've talked about today go very, very deep. And if you're a math person or you're a cryptographer, or if you're just somebody that wants this information for their own knowledge because you're interested in it, here's some resources you can jump into and dive in further. We want to thank everybody for attending our workshop here today. You guys are awesome. We've seen a lot of questions here in the chat. So let's go ahead and bring it up and see what the first one is. So what are your thoughts regarding keeping your keys truly private when it comes to acquiring Bitcoin? More and more on-ramps requiring KYC and other identifiable information. What are your thoughts on how one can mitigate this potential threat to privacy, particularly when more people are onboarding in the crypto space? This is a tough question. There's a lot of businesses and institutions where one can acquire Bitcoin. And the things that I'm always interested when that happens is, are they generating the keys? Are they custodial or not? So are they generating and managing the keys on my behalf? Because if they are, I'm not really owning the coin. Or is it something where I bring my own hardware wallet to that site or service? With KYC and regulation, unfortunately, regulation hampers industry and innovation. And it's making it harder for some businesses to compete. So if you're in the United States, for example, and you're trying to do business with US entities, a lot of those are being forced into KYC funnels due to different regulations and things that are out there. I don't have a good way to recommend that you subvert those controls, because I'm not going to advocate for that. But what I would advocate is maintaining your own personal privacy and security. If you can find sites and services that don't require all of that information, or allow you to use things like a pseudonym or a burner email address or voice over IP phone numbers, I would recommend using those sites and services. Number one, to protect your information. But number two, it's future-proofing a little bit, because we've seen things with database leaks and recent hacks where customer information has been released as a result of that. So if you can take the steps to protect your identity and protect your information before you even need to transact with some of these sites and services, I think that goes miles for your own personal security and protection.
Yeah, Ron, I think that was a great answer. And I'll just add that while KYC Bitcoin is the easiest to acquire, it's not the only way to acquire Bitcoin. There's peer-to-peer trading. You can work for Bitcoin. You can, if you have a business, you can say, I only accept Bitcoin payments, and maybe you can start minting some new whole coiners that way. But yeah, unfortunately, based on your jurisdiction, at the end of the day, whatever you do, even like even if you're mixing, you may be required to report all those, and that's the law. So there are things you can do to mitigate it, but obviously you need to play by the rules every step of the way.
Another question we have in Casa's multi-sig, this is pertinent to the Casa product itself. Which key is the one actually holding the funds? The phone key, the hardware wallet, the Casa key? So this touches on multi-signature. So a lot of the talk content that we gave today deals with single key pairs, individual key pairs. But there's a concept called multi-signature, where instead of just needing one key or one private key to move funds, you need 2 of 3 or 3 of 5. And what I'll say in that instance is that no key is really the one that's holding the funds. All of the keys in a multi-signature setup are of equal value. As long as you meet the quorum, they're going to be able to move the funds. So if you were able to compromise one key, you wouldn't be able to move those funds. That's the beauty of multi-signature. What's the most common misconception when it comes to public and private keys in Bitcoin? Do you have one you've heard of, Stacie?
I was thinking about this when I saw it going through the chat. I think a lot of the misconceptions and the confusion comes from the fact that an address is not necessarily a public key. And also, like, if you have a public key, yeah, you can generate an address that starts with 1, but like you can actually run it through the function and generate like a SegWit address, even though like you don't know how to use SegWit. I think that's where it gets a little complicated. And then also the other misconception, and it's kind of something that like I discovered while doing this presentation, is like this presentation and a lot of the public key cryptography in Bitcoin is all about digital signatures. It's not really encryption, but encryption is really cool. And we talk about it like all the time. Like I had a whole slide on how Snowden used encryption to communicate with the journalists, but like Bitcoin doesn't really use encryption that much. So that's my answer.
We have, let's see. I think for me, a big misconception, and I think as an industry, we need to get better at this. It's the UI and the UX. So we use a lot of terminology like keys and seeds and mining. And, the markets are up. So I've had a lot of people coming out of the woodwork asking me about Bitcoin recently. And they asked me if there was an e-mine found that was being mined recently. And I had to stop for a second and think, well, wait a minute, this person's thinking literal mining, that there's a mine of Bitcoin on the internet that people are going and finding and mining it. So I think we're using terminology and we're using technical terms and cryptography terms that make sense when you start using them and you've been in the industry for a little while. But I think there's still a gap that we need to be better about as an industry if we're going to onboard people and bring them into this ecosystem. They're not going to necessarily understand private public keys. So being able to abstract away from that layer, to me, helps fix some of those more common misconceptions. What is the functional difference between a seed phrase and a private key? Oh, this is a great question. Why not just keep track of the private key instead of the seed phrase? Very easy. So we have to enter these things into different devices, hardware devices. Things break. We need to rotate stuff. We get new phones. Would you rather type in 12 words that you can easily recognize, or would you rather type in a 64-bit or 128-bit string that you could very easily typo or miss a character or have to do those types of things? With private keys, there's a concept too of master private and public keys, where you can derive 10,000 private keys off a single master private key. So what I would say is it's a lot easier to store those seed phrases than to store a real long master private key or 10,000 individual private keys. The last question I think we'll take for today: how do I use the derivation paths? Do you want to take this, Stacie?
Yeah, hopefully the demo that I did with the Ian Coleman website gave you a better idea of exactly how they work. Basically, you're not going to use derivation paths unless you're a wallet developer, but it's really helpful to know what's going on under the hood. If you are a wallet developer, then basically every time you want to generate a new receiving address, you're just going to like increment the derivation path and get a new one. So, but if you want to learn more, BIP 32 is the one that you really want to focus on.
Yeah, the Bitcoin improvement proposals, those are great to dive into. They're the start of some of these concepts like Taproot and Schnorr and HD wallets and some of these other concepts we mentioned today. Unfortunately, we are out of time. You guys have been a great crowd. You've had great questions. We'd love to continue the conversation. You can find us both on Twitter yeah, thank you for attending.